So I'm excited to be driving down to the Santa Cruz Mountains to spend a few days with the computer scientist and astrobiologist Bruce Damer. And Bruce and I have been collaborating for a couple of years now. We did an event at CIIS in October 2019 and talked about his origins of life, research, his abiogenesis hypothesis, working with a team in UC Santa Cruz, including David Deemer and others, and its relationship to, or the implications for, cosmology, and some of my work on interpreting and applying Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy, his philosophy of organism. And it just so happens that the Center for Process Studies at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon is hosting this conference later this year on astrobiology and exophilosophy, I believe it's called, the sort of philosophical study of alien life or the possibility of alien intelligence, as well as abiogenesis and astrobiology. And so very, interdisciplinary type of conference that's looking to apply not just Whitehead, but other process thinkers like Bergson or Teilhard de Chardin even, just to see what sort of, service philosophy can bring to this scientific investigation of life. And so, when I first heard Bruce's hypothesis about the origins of life in these freshwater, geyser-fed ponds, or maybe even just tidal or rain-fed ponds, where there would be a cycling in any event, when whatever cause the cycling may have, geologically speaking, the cycling from wet to dry phases sort of boots up the chemical processes, building long chains of amino acids, basically, and also providing a means for these chains and these packets of chemistry, enzymes and whatnot, to be tested by being encased within liposomes. The wet-dry cycling affords the environment within which all that becomes possible. And when I heard Bruce describing this cyclical process, I thought, wow, that sounds a lot like Whitehead's account of concrescence, which is the process by which novelty is produced, right? And so here we see, in a more specific way, the chemistry of life, or proto-life, being booted up by a cyclical process that is really environmentally extended, as it were. It's a geological process, right? It involves everything from, the rotation of the Earth and the solar radiation that goes from, a day to a night cycle, to the tidal rhythms of the moon, and the fact that the Earth has a satellite that, resulted from very specific kind of collision with a large Mars-size body around 5 billion years ago. Like, all of these events that established the geological rhythm of the Earth were necessary for life itself, in the form of, free living cells, to self-assemble, right? And so these were the environmental conditions. And so Whitehead talks about the way that certain environmental patterns or social orders shelter the emergence of more complex organization within them. And so, the most widespread society or form of social order in Whitehead's cosmos is the electromagnetic society. He would talk about a geometric society that's even more general than that, but for cosmological purposes, let's talk about the electromagnetic field, which provides a certain degree of order that shelters even more complex forms of order to arise within that, right? So atoms, molecules, stars and galaxies, and then within that, and I mean not just within spatially, but within temporally, as part of a folding in of these energetic patterns upon themselves, right? And so, an example of a temporal folding would be, or environmentalizing, would be stars, first generation stars going supernova and creating heavier elements, which then, provided for the chemical pathways that could lead to life. So in other words, the multi-generational process of star formation affords or shelters the emergence of later forms of deeper organization, and in Whitehead's pan-experiential cosmos, more intense experience. Just as Teilhard de Chardin had his law of complexity consciousness, where the outward complexity correlates in some way with inward depth of experience. Whitehead also has this pan-experiential view, and I want to get to that because the question is, when we talk about the emergence of life out of this, it's a cosmic process. Is to put a long story short, it's not just a matter of, how did the chemistry create the first cell in that sort of very localized way. If you begin trying to solve the problem with just the chemistry that happens to be present in the oceans, or in hydrothermal vents, or in these freshwater ponds that Bruce and his colleagues are imagining, you're never really going to get the solution. You have to put it in the cosmological context. And when you do that, the question becomes, okay, so what's the boundary, if any, between matter, or physics and chemistry, and life? Like, why is it that this is a scientific problem that we're trying to solve? Is this boundary, is this shift in levels an artifact of our way of asking the question? Or is it one of nature's joints, as Plato was the first to, mobilize that metaphor in the Phaedrus, I believe. And I think this is an important question, and from Whitehead's perspective, we need to soften any sense of boundary, the sort of boundary that a materialistic ontology would force us to mark. You see this boundary come through even in transcendental philosophy, like in Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment, where all of the rest of the phenomenal world of nature can be determined using mechanical categories, basically the Newtonian method. And however, biology, the realm of organisms, even a single blade of grass, Kant says, somehow exceeds our ability to determine mechanically, because Kant says there's a form of causality, which he calls self-organizing, whereby the parts of an organism produce one another for the sake of a whole to which they belong. And not only is this a problem because of the holism and circular causality implied, but it's a problem for the mechanical categories that determine everything else, because a final causality purpose is being displayed, expressed, realized in this self-organizing dynamic. And so Kant, created this pretty sharp boundary. And even if later, mechanistic biologists or molecular, Darwinian biologists start to think of organisms more like machines in a way that Kant tried to forbid, just as a matter of epistemology, they're still marking a gap that needs to be closed with science. And that's why we have abiogenesis hypotheses attempting to, explain how life could arise out of chemistry. And it's all about cycling, right? Or autocatalysis or autopoiesis, or these chemical dynamics whereby a boundary is established by the components of a network or a system. And, the big question becomes, well, what about purpose? Is there purpose? And, sure, biologists, even neo-Darwinians, will talk about function, where the function of a protein or a metabolic or catabolic process the function is to serve the survival and reproduction of the organism, right? And so it's the one bit of teleology that you're allowed to bring into biology, because it defines the discipline as something distinct from chemistry and physics, because there's a process of selection. And, so there's at least teleonomy is, I think, what Ernst Mayr, the biologist, came up with. to describe this requirement that, of course, you make reference to purposes in biology, but always understanding that you're utilizing the metaphor of natural selection to give these purposes or functions their meaning. And so you get the realm of biology because you're dealing with selection. Now, from Whitehead's perspective, selection was already going on in the abiotic world, the prebiotic world. Because as a pan-experientialist, right, there is aim and there is feeling present from the beginning. Because for Whitehead, to be anything at all, to be an actual realized being or fact, is to have some enjoyment of experience. There is no other meaning of fact for Whitehead except as in the enjoyment of an experience. And so the problem with a materialistic ontology is that it imagines that there is a realm of vacuous, valueless existence, and that they simply exist in themselves without any for themselves. You know, and these are terms the German idealists thought with frequently: the in itself and the for itself. There are things in themselves, right, beyond consciousness, without consciousness, and then there's consciousness, which is for itself. And you know, for Schelling and Hegel, the goal of philosophy was to understand how the in itself and the for itself could be, you know, yeah, different, but in a way that was identical at some deeper level. So how do you bring the in itself and the for itself together? Because that seems to be exactly what living organisms are doing, bringing the in itself of physics and chemistry together in such a way as to, you know, give rise to a horizon of experience which exists for itself and no longer merely in itself. And so for Whitehead, the question becomes, was there ever just an in itself? And he says no. This is his, you know, attempt to unbifurcate nature and to say that, you know, the most intimate contact that we have with the natural world is in our own bodily experience. And it can be difficult at first, phenomenologically, to get below, first of all, the level of language and the names we have for things, to the, you know, the level of just our sensory perception of the world, which is for Whitehead still pretty abstract, given that, you know, our organism has evolved all these various sensory organs and channels through which to abstract relevance from the environment. And you know, so we have to go even below the level of our visual experience and our auditory experience and these specific sensory channels to get in touch with what he calls bodily perception, but he even calls it bodily reception, to get at the sense in which we're really dealing with the causal influx of the cosmic environment at this level. Because, you know, the body isn't a sharp boundary. It's just as much a part of nature and the environment, he says, as like the rivers, the trees, and the clouds around us. And like when a molecule is part of our body and when it is part of the environment is pretty fuzzy, because we're constantly cycling energy into and out of ourselves. And so bodily reception, our bodily experience of inheriting a past and anticipating a future, that would be one way to get at it. Whitehead says that is our most intimate contact with the essence of nature, right? And so rather than just imagining that we can understand what nature is by observing it from the outside, as though it were composed of, you know, whatever level of abstraction we want to impose upon it, you know, atomic elements or subatomic particles, or species of organ, you know, however we want to divide it up. Ultimately, below all of that is the structure of what Whitehead calls, and the dynamic of what Whitehead calls, an actual occasion of experience, which in the simplest terms is the inheritance of a past and the anticipation of a future. And, you know, so bodily reception, our own felt sense of continuity as a creature from moment to moment, that is causality. That is our participation in the movement and the repetition of time, but the repetition of time always with a difference, No two moments are the same, right? As Heraclitus said, you can't step into the same river twice. And so no thinker thinks twice in Whitehead's scheme. And when we try to imagine how life would emerge, it's not that it isn't novel. I mean, clearly it is an evolutionary advance. But there's a deeper continuity here whereby aim and purpose was already present, and whereby the cosmos itself as an energy event is also an aesthetic event. It is not a vacuous actuality. For Whitehead, to be actual is to be of some value, to realize some value for oneself, and to realize value for others. And so, the universe then becomes itself a community of organisms. And rather than physics being the most foundational science, ecology, which is the study of the relationships among organisms, evolving organisms, that ecology becomes the most foundational science. And so, these are some of the ideas that I'm trying to bring to Bruce's research here, and see, how we might be able to move the ball forward. And I won't try to summarize his work in detail. He's done that in many places, videos online and in papers, so you can check that out. But I want to just conclude by reading something that Whitehead says in his book, The Function of Reason, about cycles and how important they are in nature, physical, chemical, and biological nature. So he says, "The way of rhythm pervades all life, and indeed all physical existence. This common principle of rhythm is one of the reasons for believing that the root principles of life are, in some lowly form, exemplified in all types of physical existence. In the way of rhythm, a round of experiences forming a determinate sequence of contrasts, attainable within a definite method, are codified, so that the end of one such cycle is the proper antecedent stage for the beginning of another such cycle. The cycle is such that its own completion provides the conditions for its own mere repetition. It eliminates the fatigue attendant upon the repetition of any one of its parts. Only some strength of physical memory can aggregate fatigue arising from the cycle as a whole. Provided that each cycle on its own is self-repairing, the fatigue from repetition requires a high level of coordination of structures, a high level of coordination of stretches of past experience." And Whitehead goes on to affirm that a living body with its own self-contained organization to the self-contained is analogous to the self-contained physical organization of the material universe as a whole. In other words, as above, so below, microcosm corresponds with macrocosm. And so through this way of rhythm and the birth of a living being, it's as if life, what it does, and the way we might distinguish what makes it unique, is it has internalized its environment. It has repeated in microcosm what the universe is in macrocosm. And it doesn't begin having totally internalized everything in the environment that it needs to survive. Even 4 billion years later, life still is completely dependent upon the cycles and rhythms of its broader cosmic environment. But I think we can see over the course of evolution a movement towards autonomy, in the sense that while initially life required this wet-dry cycling, which was sort of a contingent feature of its environment in order to boot itself up, but that after the first cell emerged, it was able to persist without the need of that external cycling, but it had in a way internalized it. And as you get, you think about initially the evolution of organelles, which are able to do internally within the cell and its own metabolism what it initially required from its environment. And then in multicellular creatures, you get all these organ systems, and their rhythms, I think the rhythms of the heart and the lungs and all of our other organs are in some way an internalization of what had been environmental rhythms, right? And so we more and more begin to house within ourselves what was without us, that we were more dependent on, and we move towards autonomy. We're still, again, completely dependent on our environment. Like, you take a human being and put it on Mars, even with the sophisticated technological apparatus, you're going to run into difficulty eventually, and this is one of Bruce's points. He also does design work for NASA, and he's pretty skeptical about, the viability of life on other planets. He thinks those environments are just too harsh, and that we dramatically underestimate the extent to which our type of life process is intimately enmeshed with, the Earth, and the Earth's positionality in relation to the moon and the sun and so on. So yeah, just, some sort of speculative thoughts here. I think Bruce and I are going to record a lot of our conversation. I'm also meeting his friend, the quantum physicist Nick Herbert. So we'll talk about a lot of interesting stuff, and yeah, I'll try to continue to share it. So thanks for your attention. Thoughts are always welcome. Take it easy.